Dulcie, you let me know when I should begin.
You can start now, Emma.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So welcome, everybody. I think we've got about 52 participants joining today's spot meeting. And this is the 12th time that we're holding a spot meeting. And today's topic is on the changing workforce in the post-COVID-19 world. The Spot series is part of ADB's Southeast Asia Department seminar series that's essentially on a policy talk. And the way that we conduct these seminars is that we try to keep it informal, and rather conversational, because we want to hear from you, your views, and give you a little bit of a chance to, get the cogs in our brains working. And that's one reason why it's good to have these talks on a Friday. So what I'm going to do today, my role, I should first introduce myself. My name's Emma Allen, and I'm the Senior Country Economist based in ADB's Lao Resident Mission in Vientiane. Very pleased to be here with you today. And we have a great panel of experts that are joining us today, starting with Chong, who's our Senior Social Sector Specialist, and he's working a lot on skills development in ADB's Indonesia Resident Mission. And he's got a lot of exciting stuff to share on his support for research and development in Indonesia. Then we have Johannes. Johannes is a specialist on green jobs, and he's a senior researcher at the European Institute on Economics and Environment. So we're looking forward to hearing more about green jobs and how do we actually get some progress on green jobs. I know the concept has been around for a while, but we want to see the numbers increase for green jobs. We have Callista. And Callista is the director at Ernst & Young, and she's working on people advisory services. And she has a lot of cool insights to share from her work in Singapore that's looking at Singapore's transition in a few different ways to the digital sector and to the green economy as well. So welcome, Callista. We have Keiko. Keiko is Senior Social Development Specialist working on gender and development in ADB's Sustainable and Climate Change Department. And Keiko's got a lot of insights to share today on closing the gender gap and about how we can make some progress in that area. And last but not least, we have ILO, International Labour Organization's resident expert from their office in Bangkok, who's going to talk about recent labour and social trends. So Christian is senior economist with International Labour Organization. And with the introductions complete, Christian, I'm going to jump straight into the Q&A with you. I hope you're ready. Okay, so Christian, you've been the author of many publications for the International Labour Organization. And in your role, one of the key things that you do is monitor the trends in the labour market. So you've got all of the insights right at your fingertips. And what I'd like to know today is, what have you seen in terms of how the labour market has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the other shocks that we've seen this year? Inflation is double digits in many of the economies in Southeast Asia, and this surely has had an impact on the labour market. So what have you seen? Which sectors have been affected? Which groups of workers? What's going on with the informal economy? And what are the threats to the recovery of the labour market? Thanks. Over to you, Christian. Looking forward to your insights.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, and thanks also to the ADB for kindly inviting me to this event and share some of my views and insights. Yeah, so I think, in a nutshell, I do think that, we all know that the macroeconomic environment is quite challenging these days, globally, but also in the Asia and the Pacific region. So, there has been a lot of talk, obviously, about the recovery from the COVID pandemic, and hopefully trying to realize a human-centered recovery from the pandemic. But then, I mean, there are, and you mentioned it, there are all these other shocks that are hitting the global as well as the regional economy. Very high inflation rates, some advanced economies engaging in quite some substantial monetary policy tightening, with of course some spillover effects into developing economies of this region as well. Then we have basically, or we are starting to see some decline in consumer confidence as well, driven by the high inflation rate and the losses in purchasing power. And and also, like, just a couple of days ago, in fact, the ILO came out like with its new monitor on the world of work. So with the newest numbers and based on some very recent vacancy data that we get, not for Southeast Asian countries, but for some of the advanced economies of the world, I think it is quite likely, in fact, that employment is going to slow down significantly in those parts of the world. But if, of course, economies and labor markets are not doing well in those parts of the world, this is also going to most likely impact countries of this region, because Southeast Asia is part of the factory of the world. And if obviously consumer demand is going to go down, global consumer demand, this is going to also affect countries and labor markets in this region. So I mean, these are all the challenges. Now perhaps like some of the numbers. So what has happened so far for Southeast Asia? So when looking at the labor market impact, so what we at the ILO have been very heavily promoting is to not look only at the unemployment rate or the total number of jobs, because this is, let's say, only capturing part of the impact. We have seen many workers that might have formerly remained in employment during this crisis, but were forced to reduce their hours, most often involuntarily, due to the pandemic shock. So overall, when we look at these indicators, total hours worked in labor markets in Southeast Asia, when we do estimate that in 2020 and also 2021, working hours were roughly about 7% in both years, below the pre-pandemic level. And just to give you an idea, I mean, this corresponds roughly to about 20 million, or to the working time of about 20 million full-time jobs. So this is really very, very substantial. And like behind this number, obviously, what is there is really like lots of different more refined trends that make up this number. And I think one of the major concerns is the concern of inequality, and I think there are various dimensions to it. So on the one hand, we are concerned about increasing inequality between countries, because what we have seen is that generally advanced economies in this world have been recovering faster. Labor markets have recovered faster than some of the developing economies, including in Southeast Asia. Then we also have inequalities within countries, because some workers clearly have been more affected than others in terms of sectors. For example, sectors such as electronics manufacturing or IT services or finance or banking services. I mean, these sectors have actually done relatively well in terms of employment throughout the pandemic, while, for example, other sectors such as wholesale retail trade, or also accommodation and food service activities, so these have suffered a lot. And I mean, just out of curiosity, before this webinar, I went on trying to find some data for Thailand, for example, on international tourist arrivals. I mean, there has been an upward trend in tourism, clearly, since Thailand has opened up, but still right now, the number of tourists is not even at half the levels that we had seen before the pandemic around this time of the year. So still there is quite a bit of a way to go. Then there are also different impacts depending on different occupations, where we typically see workers in high-skill occupations being impacted or seeing a stronger recovery than people in lower or middle skill occupations. We have seen youth being affected by the pandemic much more than adults. We've seen women much more affected than men in the beginning of the pandemic, even though the recovery has actually been relatively strong for women. And I do think Keiko can later on add a little bit on this. And then, like, even if you look within those groups, like within young workers or within the group of female workers, we see that those within those groups that have higher skills actually have done relatively better. So, I mean, all this is, of course, raising major concerns with regard to inequality, and I mean, all these crises come, of course, on top of, you know, the pre-existing challenges on the labor market, because, you know, the labor market situation was not like in a perfect state before the pandemic, and we have all these trends like technological change, digitalization, greening of the economies, which do provide a tremendous amount of opportunities, but might, at least as some of those trends, might also create some challenges in the short term. And I mean, these trends are still there and are now, it's good to see them accelerated. But of course, like this, tackling, like preparing the labor market for this comes on top of all the crises that we are witnessing right now. And perhaps I stop here, and later perhaps we can talk also a little bit like about policies, because I don't want to just paint a very grim picture. I mean, the good news is that I think governments can do a lot about it to help labor markets. So back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Christian. I think one of the the thing that resonates with me and that came through really powerfully with your sharing is inequality. And there's inequality coming from everywhere, given the issues of COVID-19 and what happened to lives and livelihoods. There's risk of inequality coming from issues associated with price increases. And there's issues, and there's, you know, we're facing more mega trends. One of the mega trends is on climate. And climate will surely also link in with this issue of inequality that you're raising, Christian. And I think one of the other key takeaways for me is that inequality is there, and inequality is actually, it's still there. It's still there. We've known about it for a long time. It's still there. It's been worsened by recent trends, and surely in future, bigger issues that we're facing, such as climate change, are going to have potential implications for inequality as well. And here I'd like to bring in Johannes. Johannes, I think it's a nice segue that Christian provided on his discussion on inequality. And I think that climate change poses many risks, but it also poses risks to jobs and risks to the labor market more generally. And when we're facing those types of risks, obviously there has to be a linkage with inequality. So the question to you, Christian, is how do you see that, you know, net zero transition targets are going to, and, you know, as we make progress on them, how's that going to affect employment? And which countries in Southeast Asia are likely to be affected? And what kind of good practices have you seen out there in helping workers so far with having a more just transition, you know, so that we don't have a situation where we're again seeing inequality escalating because of needs to adjust to mega trends that are happening and unfolding. Over to you, Johannes. Looking forward to your views.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And indeed, I think my topics follow very well up on Christian's point on, let's say, the more short-term issues that we're seeing. So we are working actually for next year's Asian Development Outlook on modeling net zero transition. So we're working with the integrated assessment models, economic models to take into account climate mitigation, especially the net zero strategies and long-term pledges by countries and the NDCs, and also climate impacts. And indeed, employment effects come in two ways in this topic. One is the mitigation side. So climate mitigation is costly at some point. I mean, the move to decarbonization of the power sector, but also land use change and especially decarbonization of, for instance, transportation and industries have, of course, implications for the macroeconomy, the economic activity in these sectors, and especially also in the power sector. So what we did over the last 2 or 3 years was focus on the energy jobs, because a lot of political also action has been in kind of preventing climate action, arguing that, well, we will lose jobs, for instance, the coal sector, and of course then this can be put forward as a reason to delay, postpone, or even avoid completely this transition, which of course becomes more and more inevitable. So I think, yeah, so what we try to do is to come up with an estimate, first of all, of the employment effects of these of mitigation across countries and sectors. And here we first for the first time added this employment into this integrated assessment models, which, for instance, the IPCC in its latest assessment report that came out earlier this year has got widespread attention. So what we did for Asia, we estimated that the current jobs in the energy system, just focusing direct jobs in the energy system, are around 13 million. So that's the number of full-time people employed directly in energy supply and energy demand sectors. And this number, we can then see how by 2050, for instance, this number change under a business as usual scenario, which would continue, or under a net zero scenario. And what we find, interestingly, and we didn't expect it at the beginning, was that actually there's a slight increase to be expected, in the sense that if there were no climate policies, we find this number to increase slightly to around 15 million. So here I only talk about direct energy jobs. So if you had taken into account indirect energy jobs on the supply chains, you have to multiply this by around 3. So you get to around 45 million jobs by mid-century in the region. The IEA published another study that globally it's around 2% of the workforce in the energy system. So it's not a small share of the workforce. So I think this is an important share of jobs. And this number is likely to increase even if we move to the net zero scenario, notably due to solar and wind, which have a higher job intensity in manufacturing, because it's a very granular technology. So especially in manufacturing of solar PV panels, where especially PR China has huge amounts of jobs, estimated more than 6 to 8 million jobs just in manufacturing, which is a huge share of labor that is going to be increasing in that region. And we see losses in jobs indeed, and this is we estimated around 2.5 million in all developing Asia by 2040, for instance, which are of course important numbers of jobs, 2.5 million, and they are highly located in some countries, China and Indonesia in the region. And here then the just transition, this movement has become, of course, very important, because while the total number is increasing, so that's first good news in the sense that there is potential for increasing employment in this sector, there will be huge shifts in terms of sectors, and so especially from coal extraction and coal power generation to renewables, and this will of course have huge impacts to make these losses, let's say, compensate somehow the people who lose jobs. So they are here retraining matters, and also reskilling, and the location is important, because of course losses are located in some different regions than both nationally and within regions than the jobs that are constructed. But this year, so first there's a silver lining at the end, that at least the net zero transition per se does not need to gross losses in employment. Maybe leave it at this way for now.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So, like, my takeaway from what you've just shared, Johannes, is that there's job creation. There's definitely job creation potential as we're heading towards this net zero transition. And where there's job creation, there's job destruction, right? So managing this job destruction is the tricky thing. And because it's, there's a little bit of rigidity, and it's not so easy for the people that are the losers to become the winners. And I think that what you're saying is, here policy matters. We know the areas where there's likely to be job gains in the future. It seems to be in technologically advanced sectors. So I think that policy matters, particularly maybe education policy, gearing up towards skilling the future workforce with the types of knowledge and information that they need for doing those jobs in the future. And the other thing that kind of I took away from what you shared, Johannes, is that policy matters, and there's going to be a multiplier effect as well. So there may be direct jobs, but then there's also indirect jobs, and it's important to think about the other ancillary industries that are going to be stimulated by the policy transitions associated with net zero targets and our progress towards them. So I think that, yeah, just like you concluded, there's lots of opportunities and there's a silver lining. There is job destruction, there is job creation. How we manage that process is important, particularly for having a just transition. And this brings us to our gender expert. And I think that, Keiko, you have a lot of insights to share on this idea of a just transition and what we can do to address the issues that are facing women in the labour market, and what are some of the gender gaps in labour force recovery. How can we ensure that women are included in this process of job creation, job destruction, and new industries? Over to you, Keiko.
Thanks a lot, Emma, and thanks to Christian and Johannes for kind of giving us also some introductions of the challenges for Southeast Asia in terms of the labour market and COVID recovery. And so I guess I wanted to kind of start off with a reminder of one important fact: that COVID recovery, the COVID pandemic only exacerbated further gender inequalities we saw in the labour market. And as a reminder, this is a region that had a declining labour force participation of women pre-pandemic. This is Southeast Asia also has a very high percentage of NEETs, and most of those are women. So 25%, I think, for the Philippines, similarly also for Indonesia. This is really high, and these have labour market implications. So pre-pandemic, we also saw some of the, whatever is a reverse of a silver lining. So the downside of the digital transformation was that many female jobs were automated away. Women's jobs are also in this region, as well as the rest of the Asia Pacific, typically informal, concentrated in more vulnerable part-time employment. They earn less, there are different, because of their reproductive roles, there's a lot more disruptions within their own career. This has impacts for them at the end of their career, at the end of their lives, in terms of pension gaps, meaning in general, women tend to be more vulnerable to poverty. So all of this is pre-pandemic. The pandemic arrived, and exactly what a lot of gender specialists have been saying for a long time: if you don't address these gender inequalities, women are always at the forefront in terms of are the most vulnerable during such a crisis. So, and that's exactly what the ILO data kept on reminding us throughout the pandemic. More women lost their jobs. And Christian very rightly pointed out that in this region, there are a lot more women got jobs by, I think, 2021. ADB also has a publication that came out last year focusing just on Southeast Asia's labour market. And I think it's important to be able to qualify what some of that data shows, and the importance of being able to understand where women are working, where they were working, and where they're working now. And it remains a little bit the same in informal jobs, not exactly decent work. And these are also obviously at risk of being automated away at some point. So high vulnerability for female jobs in this labour market. I think at some point we're going to start talking about policy, so I'll talk a little bit about some of my thoughts about that at another stage. But I did want to kind of flag some of the, some of the key areas that we're talking about today. Let's say green recovery, green jobs, digital transformation, these are typically sectors that don't employ a lot of women. So there's a big challenge, I think, ahead if we are to build back better and to seize those opportunities to make sure that women don't fall further behind, which is a real risk without proper policies in place. The sector that does hire a lot of women, and I think for Asia Pacific, something like 126 million women, 126 million people for work in the care economy, and that covers health, education, social services. Close to, I think, 65%, so 2/3 basically of those people are women. But those are also, again, sectors that tend to be low paid, and women tend to be in the more vulnerable parts of those sectors. So this is a bit of my doom and gloom part, where I kind of stress about the importance of being able to look at that gender lens when we adopt any type of policy. And when we think about recovery, we need to think about inclusive recovery that takes into account where women are, and that type of policy should really cater to those weaknesses in the labour market, if you want to call it that. Another area I just wanted to quickly touch upon was on entrepreneurship. So another key part, we see from a lot of the surveys that have come out that women entrepreneurs were hard hit, again, because of the type of sectors that they work in. They tend to be very small. So in Southeast Asia, I think 60% of MSMEs are perhaps owned by women. Most of those are concentrated in the micro enterprise. So there's also patchy data on this issue, but there is a real issue for women to graduate to become SMEs. They tend to be small, and there's a lot of issues around access to resources, but also access to trade, access to markets. So again, recovery, if we want an inclusive recovery, we need to think about how do we get women into a better position? How do we reduce those gender gaps? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Keiko. So how do we reduce the gender gaps? Indeed. And I think that what you brought up is that informality is an issue, gender gaps are an issue, and we haven't really seen the needle move on these issues too much. Yeah, you mentioned you said at the beginning of your introductory remarks, you said, what's the reversal of a silver lining? And that just brought me back to reality, to think that we do have a lot of issues that need to be addressed. And I think those issues need a lot more visibility as well. Things like, where are these women working? Are they working in their homes? What type of contracts do they have? And that type of information can shed a lot of light on issues for women. And then you mentioned that the majority of women do tend to work in micro and small enterprises. Many of them are in the informal economy. So this is a segue into contribution from Callista. Callista, you've been working a lot in Singapore, but micro and small enterprises are all over Southeast Asia, and they have different types of statuses. The micro enterprises in Singapore may have a different experience to what those do in Indonesia or where I'm from, Laos People's Democratic Republic. You have experience in a few economies, and I was wondering if you could share some insights on how you've seen SMEs being affected by labour markets, and what some of the experiences that you've seen in promoting transitions. It could be a green transition, it could be a transition to the digital economy. Yeah, grateful for your insights.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you. And thanks, I think, all the panelists, for what you've shared earlier. I think it lays a very strong ground around what we're talking about. So I think from the labor markets, let me talk about it from two perspectives, a bit more from a Singapore, Malaysia type of a view. And then in the other markets around where I work with in the whole of EY. So I think if we, again, consider what was pre-pandemic as well as then where are we right now, it's not yet over. It's still in progress. It's getting better. I think what I would say Christian and even Johannes tried to share. Pre-pandemic, I would say digitalization has been moving fairly slow, right? If anything, the pandemic definitely accelerated for some organizations. And for many, it just, makes a bigger change for around why some digitalization is required. If I were to talk about the current state of where, say, SMEs are from a Singapore and Malaysia market, one thing that's very common across all of ASEAN is SMEs actually make up a large proportion of companies within the country. Likewise, even in Singapore, right? And they hire quite a fair bit of people in the country as well. Now, SMEs, as well as I would say the non-SMEs, and from a Singapore market perspective, they are facing very different type of challenge. And I'll paint a little bit around what the Singapore challenge has been that's slightly different. Singapore is very hard pressed, and we are in this drought for talent. And the drought for talent is not just from a skills perspective, but there's just not enough people. So quantum of people is short. So therein lies a little bit of a complexity for a market like Singapore, where I can hire, I just can't seem to find just the people to hire. So what that means is an employees market. So it's kind of like my market. I get to choose around where I want to work. And with that in mind, it definitely affects the SMEs, because either from a perspective, they may not show possibility of a career progression. Perceptively, people think they don't pay well, so on and so forth. So the SMEs market in Singapore, it's a little bit hard pressed. What that also means is they, in a way, have taken upon themselves to hire, look, whomever I can hire, I'll hire. And then I'll put them through a training, right, on the job. And that's really the lay of the land a little bit around Singapore. If I were to flip on the rest of ASEAN, and what we see is a little bit different. There are lots of opportunities, lots of jobs, but people are finding it hard to hire, again, perceptively, that either one, I'm not looking at the right places, which is possible, or two, there is a little bit of a gap in the possible skill sets to fill some of these jobs. So that's a little bit of a switch around how some of the labor markets are looking at today across ASEAN. But I do want to stress upon one very interesting fact that we have seen, and it's a study by EY around humans at the center. And it is showing that employee preferences have shifted, right? And I will paint a bit more of a gloom side, not gloomy side, but a bit more of a bright side around what that actually means for Singapore perspective. So what that means for companies operating in Singapore is employees get to really choose and almost dictate and say, look, if you don't give me XYZ, I really don't want to work with you. And that has actually forced a lot of organizations, especially SMEs, to shift their policies, and quite a fair bit. And I'll give you an example. When I'm working with the food services sector, I think Christian and all just shared earlier. So food services, I would say logistics, even tourism, they have to actually shift their operating model to cater to some of these employee preferences. And I'll give you a classic example. If I think of restaurants, I start from 11 through to 10, depending on when people decide to leave the restaurant, I'm expected to then serve until someone leaves the restaurant. What that also shows is, if I really want to hire somebody, I actually do have to consider their patterns. And there's this particular organization that I work with where actually a large proportion of people that they hire are females. What they had to do was to say, look, I'm going to close at 9:30. Last guest out at 9:30, because why? My staff needs to go home, sleep early, prepare for breakfast the next day so that they can cater to their kids and bring them to school and then come to work at 10. So in order to make, I would say, capture the talent that they need, they had to make some tweaks around policies and company policy for that matter to adjust to that. Similarly, what we also do see is a shift of, I would say, working hours pattern, right? If I want to capture the stay-home parent market, I will have to cater that, say, look, I allow you to work, say, from 2 to 6 so that you can go back home, prepare dinner, and then come back tomorrow. So we see a lot of such options, which also gives rise to the gig economy, actually, where you see a lot more people in the gig economy and wanting that flexibility. So that's what we pretty much see from SMEs in the labor market. I know there's something else on green jobs that I can speak about, but I just want to take a pause and hand it back to you. And I think we can have a window for green jobs and just transition on just a later discussion. Yeah, over back to you, Emma.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the insights. Yeah, I did a publication just like you earlier in the year, and I was looking at SMEs in Asia, and we were reviewing the literature, and what we understand is that about 60% of GDP in Southeast Asia is contributed by SMEs. And that's more than what large enterprises contribute, and it's more than what the government contributes. And what that means is they're a really important economic stakeholder because they're contributing a lot to GDP. Now, not only do they contribute to GDP, they form the majority of enterprises, and then they also create the majority of jobs as well. So they're a really, really important partner. And it's important to have mechanisms available for helping their operation. And you mentioned that Singapore has some mechanisms available, but the employers themselves have actually taken initiative in Singapore and created some mechanisms for enabling their enterprises to be more productive and viable. One of them you mentioned is that employers identify a worker that they want to invest in, and then they do invest in the training of that worker to bring them up to speed with what they want. But then the employer is being flexible and trying to treat the employee as somebody who adds value to the enterprise. So I think that's an interesting insight that you shared, that it's in Singapore, it's not only about employees selling their labor, it's about employees adding value to the enterprise and finding ways for the enterprises to operate that adds value for everyone. It sounds like an ideal situation to be in. I think the skills gaps are definitely there, and what you mentioned is that it's been employers that have taken initiative for addressing some of those skills gaps. But there's a role for a lot of different stakeholders to work on that issue, and this is where I wanted to invite Chong to come in. Chong, there's skills gaps exist. They always exist. And there's a role for the public sector here. There's a role for the private sector and employers. And then there's also a role for the workers themselves to invest in their skills. So Chong, I wanted to ask, what's your assessment of how the pandemic has impacted on public policy, particularly education and TVET institutions in Southeast Asia? How are they adapting with this kind of, the shake-up that we've seen over the last few years in our operating environment? And what are the new skills that are required by the future workers, and how are the institutions responding to them? And what can ADB do to, support this transition as well? Over to you, Chong. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. It's kind of interesting, to sort of hear from Johan, Christian, Keiko, Kalista, because essentially, they really focus a lot on the demand side of the labor market, what pandemic has resulted in, in the changes to the labor market, as well as, the transition to new energy sources, So, but my side, I sort of want to talk a little bit about the supply side, of things, before the pandemic, right? We sort of think that our education system is really good, right? The policymaker, the education policymaker, the educator focus a lot on relevant, of education system, the quality, access, equity, so on and so forth, right? But then, as we now know, when the pandemic hit, more than 180 countries have to shut their schools. And then additionally, at the height of pandemic in 2020, just in Asia alone, schools that were fully closed, on average 50% of teaching days, so that was really serious, right? So, because of that, educators, policymakers, even in, developed countries, not only just developing countries, in developed countries recognize and realize that there's a need to make the education system more resilient. That includes, not just the K-12, but also TVET and higher education. Right, so resilience of education, is really something important arising from pandemic, right? And because of that, there's also a big push, in terms of implementation of education technology, the use of education technology to deliver training, to deliver education program, and I would say, EdTech, sort of become mainstream because of the pandemic, at all levels of education system. And because of that, there's also an important need to relook into the pedagogy side of how do you do a hybrid training? How do you make use of education technology? Particularly, in terms of the interaction, of among the students, because that's a very big aspect of it, be it in K-12 or TVET or higher education, how do you incorporate, how do you change the pedagogy so that you still get, the desired learning outcome that can meet the need of the employers or meet the need of the next stage of education, for each cohort. So those are some of the important changes that is happening. Hopefully, enough resources are being provided, by government of each country to support that. So what are the new skills needed? I think this is also something that is evolving. Because there's a lot more push, as mentioned by the panelists, before me, into digitalization. In fact, if you look at before pandemic, right, Industry 4.0 is already, going full steam, and pandemic has not slowed down Industry 4.0 transition. And then with the energy crisis, that is happening now, and of course, the big push, to reduce the carbon footprint, the energy sector, including the transport sector, all these are changing as well. So the need for skills, in the in clean energies are also coming in, right? So last year, ADB and LinkedIn, worked together to do a study on these digital skills that are critical for jobs in Asia Pacific. So the report was published just last month in October. So it's kind of interesting also, to look at the report. You can easily download it. You just go to ADB website, or you go to the Google. You just search for it. It is there, right? So in the report itself, it actually says that basic digital literacy and skills are needed across all jobs and occupation, regardless. And what are those? Digital communication and collaboration, basic internet skills for commerce online purchases, mobile banking, the ability to use online financial and government services, social media, basic computer skills, even basic skills to use, like Microsoft Office suite. So those are really essential. No argument about that. So those definitely have to be incorporated, into the education, curriculum, be it K-12 or be it TVET or be it higher education. right? So in the LinkedIn report, it also emphasized the need, what are the type of applied digital skills, and those actually includes animation, the ability to use big data to make decision and manage decision making, computer graphic, digital arts, digital data tools, so on and so forth. And the next category is actually skills for computer software and hardware. So the need, to have the kind of skills able to work in companies that generate, computer software, hardware, including data storage technologies, including enterprise cloud computing, so on and so forth. And then the last category, in that report, sort of emphasize advanced disruptive digital skills that's required. So that actually would include, artificial intelligence, machine learning, skill set, in operating autonomous vehicle, even, assembling autonomous vehicle, so on and so forth. So a very interesting report, those who are interested, please go and read about it. There are a lot more, information inside that. And what is ADB doing, to support the digital transition? Even, before COVID, we were already doing a fair bit of work in terms of supporting our developing member country to manage the digital transformation in the economy. So we have a pipeline project that is supporting Philippines, the Technical Education Skill Development Authority. Is a skill development project, a TVET project, focusing very much on introducing Industry 4.0 skill set, the like of data, use of sensor, AIoT, artificial intelligence, so that the students who complete schooling in the TESTA TTI are able to sort of support small medium enterprises where they typically find jobs in integrating digital transformation in the company processes. So that's one project. In Cambodia, we are also supporting a pipeline project called Skill for Future Economy. So the very much focus, future economy means that there's a need to look into the potential changes, transformation that's happening across different economic sector. What are the skill set that are required as per the future economy? I will talk a little bit about that, in the policy session later. And of course, we also did, quite a number of studies in for ASEAN country, for Southeast Asian country on the impact of Industry 4.0, both from the supply side and demand side. So the reports are all available there. And in Indonesia, we also have a new project that's in the pipeline that should be approved this year and going into implementation next year. That is promoting research and innovation through modern and efficient science and technology park, very much focused on using advanced research and development equipment, which are Industry 4.0 enabled to support research work, and it's a lot about, data, collection, the ability to manipulate data, the data science part of support. But at the same time, the project also have substantial support in supporting applied research, because we want to increase the knowledge base under this project so that, Indonesia economy can transition away from, just the pure, resources dominated economy, and also a huge support on technology entrepreneurship, with a very strong focus, on supporting women in technology startup incubation. So I will stop here. So over back to you, Emma.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing, Chong. And I think that new project that you're working on is really about making the dreams of policymakers come true. Indonesia has been wanting to upgrade and diversify its economy and move towards commercialization of research that's domestically, homegrown for a long time. And I'm so glad to hear that your investment project is going to help to catalyze that policy shift. So it's really wonderful. Chong, I think that you as a person represent the meeting of supply and demand, because you're the education expert, but you're also a worker yourself. You mentioned a few things, Chong, and one thing that you said is that Industry 4.0 is moving ahead, full steam ahead, but it's not moving ahead full steam in all of our economies, and I think that that's important to take note of as well. How many people are able to jump on that train, and then how many people are kind of struggling but missing the train, and then how many people are just, totally not at the station at all. And I think that this brings up another thing that you were emphasizing is about the need for having a more learning society, approach to lifelong learning and skills transition, and just to have in your mind, how can I grow and how can I develop my skills, as a constant question that we're asking ourselves. You ran through a bunch of different technology skills that are going to be in demand in future, and I'm really excited to hear about them. And you mentioned applied skills as well. But one of my points, Chong, is that you said that basic skills in Microsoft Office, and I think Microsoft Office basic skills are not basic at all. It's actually quite advanced, and it's a fundamental skill that functions as a building block for developing other types of skills, and there's different proficiencies in skills. So I think that it's good to go back to those fundamental skills and make sure we've got building blocks so that when workers move into the labour market, employers can continue to invest in their skills as well. So this brings us back to Christian. We're talking about transition, Christian, and how to ensure that workers have fundamental skills and building blocks for continuing with their to improve their employability. I wanted to ask you, what are some policies that can help workers transition? And transition more, I'm thinking about our dream of transitioning to a real green economy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma, for this question. And yeah, very interesting to listen to the previous speakers and listening into their insights. So yeah, I mean, when we talk about transitions, I mean, I think, we've mentioned those. I mean, various transitions are happening, transitioning into a green economy, transitioning into a digital economy. But then, I mean, the real challenge is really, like, how do we make sure that, as you say, Emma, that really everybody is on board of that train? And some of these transitions, like at least in the short run, I think can also, let's say, cause some problems for workers, some negative impacts on the labor market in terms of job losses for workers that have not been having a job in the green economy, but in the brown economy, or like the industries that like with lots of CO2 emissions. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of workers that might actually get replaced by some automation technologies, and I think it's quite important to recognize that like at least in the short run there might be some adverse impacts, at least affecting some of the workers. And there, as a policy, clearly, and like social protection does play a very, very important role to make sure that like those workers that lose their job are not forced to accept the next best or low quality job that comes around the corner. but they are actually getting the time and that they have the economic resources to in fact find a good match, and which is also then beneficial for the economy, obviously. And like if the productivity of the worker is really fully exploited, I mean, there's really, I think there's nothing more effective and nothing less productive in an economy than like if you have like university graduates ending up on a job like as a, I don't know, taxi driver, which is an important job, but which clearly probably does not make use fully of their skills. And like governments, by providing in many of the economies, public free education and public universities, by investing so much in that education system, and then in the end, let's say you get a taxi driver out of it. I mean, the task of the taxi driver, the job is very important, but perhaps that's not like the most efficient use of resources. So social protection is clearly important, that to provide, let's say, a cushion to those that actually in the short run lose their job, and support them in that way. And on skills development, it's like I was very happy to listen to Chong, because I think you raised a little bit the issue that like sometimes also in like the let's say more basic skills are very important. And around 3 years ago, we did a study looking at exactly like those strategies that countries in this region have to prepare themselves for the future of work. And we have specifically looked at the Industry 4.0 strategies. And what you do find in there is like, or sometimes you get the impression that, I mean, the focus is very much on like training those that are already high skilled to really bring the country to the technological frontier, which is important, but I think it's only part of the story, because sometimes like to make really everyone in the labor market participate, in the great opportunities and gains that can be made from these transitions. I think sometimes like the basic investing in basic skills is also more important. And sometimes, second point, you also get a little bit the impression that you would make out of a fruit seller on the street overnight like some software engineer, which is clearly, we know all that is not really realistic. So I think some realism is important there. And then in terms of further support of workers to make those transitions, clearly I think also promotion of entrepreneurship is very key to really give the right incentives to workers. And here I think it's also important to take into account, we all want to have a just transition to really transition to the green economy, to the digital economy in a fair and inclusive manner. And so there are perhaps like some ways to target those entrepreneurships towards those groups on the labor market that have not been doing that well, such as, for example, youth. And I think there's just a lot of potential there. Very often, countries put in place entrepreneurship programs, but these are often not very well targeted and also often quite sporadic. So, some program here, some program there, but I do think it's also really important to, let's say, approach this more systematically and really have also a whole strategy to think about how can we make sure that those transitions are done in an equitable and fair manner, so that not just like a small elite in the country can benefit from it, but that really the benefits are more broad-based and more fairly distributed in the different economies. So I leave it at that and hand back to you, Emma.
Thanks, Christian. I like what you were saying about a university graduate who's driving a taxi. It happens everywhere across the world, and it's been happening for a long time. And it's something that I also ask myself: did I make the right choice in being an economist? I still don't have the answer to that question, but I think that individual choice is informed by information. And this is what you were saying, labor market information is a really important commodity, and it's important to be communicated to workers, students, whoever it is, so that we can make good choices about our futures. And this kind of reminds me about the importance of the information that Chong was sharing on demand for future skills. It can seem quite abstract, that, you know, we're going to be moving towards this very futuristic society, and the futuristic society is going to be preferencing advanced skills in robotics and cloud computing and other types of things that are totally beyond me. But that information is important to make available, and it can play an important role in helping to minimize this skills mismatch issue and skills gaps issue, try and motivate people to move into those sectors. So I think this kind of brings us back to Johannes. You know, Johannes, we're going to be transitioning, and I'm totally committed to all policies related to moving our societies towards net zero emissions. What can we learn from countries that are already implementing policies that are related to achieving their net zero transmission targets, particularly for this just transition and ensuring that people have the information that they need to facilitate that just transition? Please, please, Johannes. If we have Johannes. Or, okay, so I invite maybe Christian to jump in on that one.
Sorry, I was just busy typing a response to one of the questions. So can you just quickly repeat the question?
So I think that like you highlighted, Christian, a little bit about the role of information. Like I'm thinking about labour market information systems and putting the signal out there that we want skills in this area. And I'm just wondering, do you have any examples from any countries that seem to be good at doing this, particularly for moving towards implementing net zero emission policies?
Yeah, perhaps I cannot really provide a concrete example, but I mean, I think generally like this what you're mentioning, I think also relates a little bit to skills forecasting, you know, like, and really understanding like what are exactly the area, you know, like where workers will be needed. And I mean, to some extent, I think the picture is that we are having now is quite clear in the sense that, you know, we do, for example, have the care economy, because and the importance is undoubtedly going to rise in many countries, because yeah, I mean, we have aging populations, and many countries in the region are experiencing that. Then in terms of digital economy, yeah, we are moving into that direction. So clearly these digital skills are going to be key. I mean, digital skills really at all levels. And we are also moving to the green economy, where, you know, like this specific expertise on you know, like how to deal with environmental changes, and, you know, like how to adapt to climate change, and also how to mitigate climate change. I mean, these skills are going to be important, like for you know, like jobs development moving forward. And it's really these skills that will be needed. And of course, you know, like, I mean, currently, at least when talking about greening and digital economy, I mean, I think these are highly specific and specialized skills. So perhaps there's also like a little bit of, you know, competition out there on the labor market. You know, like competition, like who gets like those few workers that like have these expertise. And then I think factors that Kalista mentioned early on, you know, like providing a good workplace, a good you know, like a flexible workplace that takes into account the needs of the individual worker. I think, you know, these factors certainly do play a role when you're like kind of trying to attract the talent. But I mean, again, I think it's you know, in the longer term, I think it should be really more than that. I think these transitions, yeah, I mean, there are plenty of opportunities there, and it should not really be only like the high skilled workers like that would benefit from those transitions, but it should really be more broad based. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, I like the point on it's not only for the high skilled workers. There needs to be democracy in access to good quality jobs. Chong, can I invite you to provide some insights? You know, how do we get this information, and how do we get these signals right for moving towards our net zero policy? What can we do better as policymakers for moving towards this wonderful society that we're all dreaming of in future.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's really important, you know, to do a diagnostic, you know, be it, you know, for digital transformation or for, you know, a green transition, right? If you look, you know, in the what the Singapore government did, you know, they a few years ago, you know, it actually came out with the industry transformation map, cutting across 23 industry sectors. So and that was a few years ago, you know, and it was really interesting because it actually identified almost in all industry sector what are the digital transformation that's going to happen. And I think substantially, you know, some of them, you know, also cover, you know, the future transformation, you know, in terms of green transition, you know, that's required. If they have not, you know, revised it, you know, or if they have revised it, I'm sure, you know, it would also, you know, the industry transformation map for each industry sector they identified would have covered also the green transition as well. So I think from that aspect of it, I think it's kind of really important, you know, as a first a starting point, you know, to look into the skill that are required in the future economy. But nobody knows, you know, where the future start, right? It could even, you know, what we because there's always a process, right? You know, the future, you know, when you start, you know, to do the diagnostic, you know, the future is already happening in a way, right? So, you know, so that is an important aspect of it, you know. But you know, that also, you know, did not stop at just the so-called industry's transformation. They also, you know, follow it through. Singapore also follow it through with the qualification framework, skill qualification framework. I think that's what it was called. Or skill framework, you know, not qualification, skill framework, you know, for each of the identified sector. And essentially what it does is actually it map out, you know, the needs in each of the industry sector, and then look at, you know, what is already currently available in terms of training programs, training courses, institutions that have the capability to do it, you know, and they do a sort of a match. And beyond that, right, whatever that is not available, you know, to cater it, you know, that is where resources are being poured or has been poured into. Of course, you know, what is important in terms of, you know, doing a diagnostic like this is that it should not be static. It has to be really, you know, dynamic, you know. And how do you do dynamic? You know, again, that is where, you know, the data collection, you know, in terms of the changes in the job market, you know, those are really important. And the other aspect of it is that in the ADB study on Industry 4.0, I think that was in 2020, it was published. The report was called Reaping the Benefit of Industry 4.0 for Southeast Asian study, for Southeast Asian country were part of the study. And what happened was that, you know, if you look at the report, you also mentioned about the need to really, you know, analyze, you know, the potential of future changes in terms of what transformation is going to happen, you know, to the economy, to each industry sector, you know, or economic sectors. And based on that report, 4 countries were involved, if I'm not wrong, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia. So, and following the release of the report, you know, we also supported the Cambodian government to look into the industry transformation just for the apparel and garment sector, which is one of the major economic sector in Cambodia. So that is something that we would, you know, continue to support, you know, in a way, sort of to make sure that, you know, we are able to sort of be it for digital transformation, you know, green transformation, or what may come next, you know, to match between the demand and supply. So I stop here, Emma.
The thing that you're telling me, Chong, is that it needs to be constant. This diagnostic and this understanding, it's a constant effort that we need to make. And I think that kind of matches with my earlier takeaway of what you were sharing, that we need to really be a learning society. And that means that diagnostics needs to be at the front of your mind, and you need to be forward-looking and committed to looking forward all the time. And then you also mentioned the Singapore example. I checked out the Singapore Job Futures web pages, and I was just like astounded by the amount of effort that had gone into understanding where do industries want to go, and then understanding, okay, what's the job requirement of those industries, and then that feeds back into the training institutions, education and training institutions, and that's so important for like getting the wheels moving on this transition. And it brings me back to Callista, who's located in Singapore. So how I want to focus more on digital transformation. How is digital transformation going to shape future jobs and labour markets? And what are some of the measures to protect traditional and non-traditional workers? Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. So I actually want to acknowledge, I think, what Chong said. So I think EY has been very supportive with all of these efforts. And actually, for the whole skills framework perspective, EY actually did half of that, like 17 out of 34. But I do want to, stress on one very important thing. It is not a stamp in time, right? Jobs are changing, and some sectors are moving way ahead than what you see on the internet. And I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight is, in addition to this whole industry transformation map, of which this year alone in the last month, there were 4 new ones that's being introduced as a 2.0. So it's an upgrade and a refresh to what was done in that. And in that same breath, what is also then being done is to say, look, these are all the transformation. What does it mean for jobs, right? And I do want to highlight that digital and green is not unique. It has to come together, right? In order for green jobs to actually accelerate and to grow, there must be a baseline of digitalization skill sets. And why do we really say that? So in the work that at least EY is doing now in Singapore to identify green skill sets and green jobs, fundamentally the basics that Singapore have in place actually helps accelerate some of these work that's now being done in the future, because we've got the basics has been identified. The key question is, what is green economy? And I think Christian talked about that earlier on. Is it green economy? Is it brown? Where are we really headed towards? So I think identifying what that really means for each country is quite important, because what the green economy means for Singapore is probably very different from the rest of ASEAN, right? So that's number one. Number two, for Singapore, green skill sets are not 100% of the green skill sets doesn't include to 100% of a job. What that means is jobs today will be needing green skill sets, which means it's just a top up. For as long as you can't identify what those base skill sets are, it will be also very hard for you to identify what the green skill sets, so that you can try and anticipate that transition. I think what people are usually afraid of is change. And I think, again, a job with green skill sets is not something that is probably unattainable. It is attainable, right, for at least some of the jobs today. So identifying what the delta is from a skill set angle is quite important. And you can't solve everything at once. So it's also then very important to identify which are the sectors you want to start with first. And we usually start upstream, right? So for example, energy and power, that's really the sector that's driving through net zero, carbon, so on and so forth. And then if I, again, bring from a case in Singapore around what are the work that I've been doing right now is, there are a few key sectors that, again, from a digital and green comes together is finance, energy, mobility, manufacturing, as well as facilities management. And I want to bring in the whole construction piece here, because if you think about it, construction does contribute to a fair bit of carbon emissions in every market. So having some of these green skill sets given to some of these individuals in jobs today is very, very critical. And that's, again, comes back to what Chong has been saying from a supply perspective. Schools will have to shift how they are looking at curriculums today, right? I think the traditional way of updating curriculums that takes years may not necessarily be very viable. So there might need to be a two-pronged approach around, look, I still have a curriculum in place, but are there any short-term programs that can help people upskill and reskill, as the markets move? Because the markets are moving very, very quickly. and it's not viable and feasible for the school to continuously change their curriculum year on year. It's a lot of effort. So and just on the last point, I do, and before I hand over to Keiko, I think there is definitely a role for many parties to play, and it's not a role for just one party. I think government, schools, organizations, as well as workers, right, will have to come together. And if I think about the transition, or the energy transition and the green economy, unfortunately, it might need to start at the government and policy level, right? And then bring in the rest of the ecosystem into it to contribute, such that we can also make sure that people who needs to take on new jobs have the right skill sets. And for jobs that are being impacted, like what Keiko and the rest of my panelists have said, that they're not taking the next best job, which is actually a worse job than what they had before. So I think that transition is actually, I would say, more important now than it is ever. Yeah. So Emma, I'll hand it over back to you, and I think Keiko probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I like your discussion about rigidities, and it made me, think about all traditional labor market rigidities, but then you also just related it to the personal level, where you said people are afraid of change. And then I think the answer to both of those issues is about information. So we're talking about, improving labor market information, not necessarily ensuring that it feeds into modification of curriculum, but at least have the information there so that it can be used for supporting change. And I think that helps with labor market rigidities, and it also helps at the individual level. So just bringing it back to a bit of behavioral economics, it was a really, really interesting insight. Okay, so over to Keiko. What are some of the policies to promote gender inclusive recovery, and how can development partners like ADB, you and me, Keiko, and the rest of us from ADB on the call here, what can we do to support developing member countries achieve this goal? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. And thanks so much to all my other panelists. There was a lot of food for thought there, and especially I really liked some of the talk about, the future is already now. That's definitely the case when we talk about gender inequality or gender equality. I started like at the beginning of this panel being quite pessimistic, and now I guess talking about the things that countries are already doing, the private sector is already doing, and that we can, can be scaled up with the support of development partners, ADB, ILO, and many others. One of them, Christian flagged about the care economy. I also talked about how many women work in the care economy. I think there's a real opportunity that we've seen through COVID, and definitely there is the silver lining, is that now I think more governments are recognizing the value of care and investing in care as a sector, which means really looking at the infrastructure needs, looking at costing, making sure it's affordable, quality, decent work options. There's been a lot of analysis that's been done for a while by feminist economists and many others, including ADB also. And so again, the future is now. It's really now to look at care. Another one also to just touch about some of the other themes. So looking at governments can be looking at women through a life kind of course. So thinking about training across the life cycle, life course is really key. I was really struck by something that Callista said about, we need short, medium, longer term policies for this. I completely agree. So right now there is a crunch. We see that women's jobs are being automated away. They need to be given the type of skills to get into other jobs. I know ILO has been doing some really interesting pilots in our region, I think Philippines and Indonesia, maybe Thailand and Malaysia also. And I think these are types of pilots that have that work and can be scaled further. So we know those jobs are going to go. Let's work now to make sure that the future is a bit better for women in terms of those decent jobs. What other types of skills do women need to learn now to be able to face the challenges that are coming ahead? So, and this, I'll kind of come back now to what is the role of development partners. So we talk a lot within ADB about ADB being a climate bank. I also like to hope aspirationally that we can also be a gender bank in many respects. And we are in have some of the infrastructure for that already. We all know that ADB has a corporate target for climate change of 75%. We also have the similar target for gender of 75% by 2030 of our operations, so our investments. This is a real opportunity to kind of think outside of the box to make sure that women are really at the center of our development investments. And I think setting targets, working with other development partners, and thinking a little bit on how economies can work better for women would be great. So moving away from band-aid approaches and thinking exactly what Trung was saying, the future is already now. So we really need to be looking at, there's been a lot of great analysis and data already done. We should be already incorporating that into our policies. I think COVID showed us a little bit what we expected, that women would be the worst affected by such pandemics and by the crisis. So I don't think we need any more learning in that respect. I think it's really time to invest and working with other development partners to be able to make sure that recovery is really inclusive. Thanks.
Thanks, Keiko. Okay, so now we're down to the last 10 minutes of today's discussion, and we've got some rapid fire questions that have come from our 89 participants. Callista, a question for you. In Nepal, most SMEs were closed down during the COVID-19 containment policy era. How about the post-COVID status of these SMEs? What interventions have been made to revive these enterprises, or were no interventions made? Over to you.
Well, thanks. I think that's a difficult question, I have to say. So I would say SMEs, and as well as some large corporates, to be honest, were actually very significantly affected by COVID, right? And they were forced to shut down for many reasons. One, from a demand perspective, which is no demand because spending has gone down. Second, or from a supply perspective, because borders have closed, borders have shut, people may have to go home and they can therefore not work in some of these cities, right? So I think from a various prong approach that has happened. Interestingly, what you might also notice is even as SME starts to shut, there were also new businesses that appeared during COVID. Now, if I were to just respond from a policy, and if I were the king of Singapore, which I'm not, I think there are a couple of things that policies can drive. But yet at the same time, there are also some things which policies can't address, right? So fundamentally, I think what Christian and a few others mentioned just very early on, when the pandemic struck, there were a few things that governments could give out. And for countries that had more handouts, we also saw a lot more people surviving through the pandemic, right? So therein lies one of the good ways of how policies, or what hopefully policies can address, assuming some countries got deeper pockets than others, that some of these handouts actually help. But I think what the policies need to continue to address is, look, we've gone past that. It's a little bit more of a recovery now. I mean, fingers crossed that, I would say inflation doesn't hit harder than it is and then go into a technical recession again. The question about jobs and skill sets has to be answered. And I think policies around the continued education, the continued training, continued access to training, right, will need to be very important, because as some sectors or economies shut down, there will be new ones that will come up. And there must be and should have policies in place to make sure that people have the opportunity to access to that so that they can go into those jobs. Because there are going to be a lot of jobs that will be created, and you will soon find a supply side issue where you've got more demand and just no supply. And that might cause a little bit more of a different upheaval. So if I were, again, the king of Singapore, which Singapore doesn't have one, that would be my wish list. And I would wish for, I would say, most of the governments to continue thinking about it from that perspective as well.
Yeah, I think it's really the role of the state to help with these transitions and safety nets so that we can have some buffer, because shocks happen. Shocks do happen, yeah. Rapid fire question number 2, Keiko. Now, you mentioned earlier that there are so many micro enterprises in this world, and that it's difficult to grow up to be a small, a medium, or a large enterprise. So I think that this is a kind of perennial question. Do you have any countries that have been particularly good in getting their micro enterprises to grow up, and then to, close the missing middle issue? Over to you.
Well, the missing middle in terms of women graduating from micro to SMEs, I don't know a single country that's resolved that, and that includes developed like OECD economies. It's a challenge across all. I think there are good initiatives that have been done, and there are countries that have more women who own SMEs than others. In the Asia Pacific, in Central West Asia, for example, I think it's around 34% of SMEs are owned by women. That's a good indicator about some of the policy environment. It talks about a lot of other things, women's access to capital that allows them to be able to grow their business. I think this also kind of reflects about something that Callista had said about that question regarding Nepal. I think some governments have been really innovative. Some of them have used deeper pockets. Let's say in Australia, for example, where I originally come from, there was a scheme to make sure that businesses couldn't close, so the government helped pay for the labour costs. In ADB, we did a lot of COVID support programs, and we saw that there was a lot of tax relief in Vietnam through a Women's Entrepreneurship Finance Initiative grant. We did a special COVID-19 relief where a grant that went to financial institutions that restructured loans to 500 women SMEs. So there's some deep pockets and there's some innovation, I think, that to be thought about, because the last example of a grant didn't need a lot of money to be able to do that. So it's also trying to kind of use whatever levers and incentives there are to be able to support that. But to the question about the graduation from micro to SMEs, there's no real answer, but there are some countries that have really invested in terms of access to markets, because I think what we've all been doing quite a lot is that we've also been locking in women into the micro segment. There's a lot of microfinance that 80–90% of microfinance goes to women. We already know that, but the pathways out are not that obvious, and they're largely unexplored. So there are a lot more that we could be doing in terms of improving kind of that finance access. Women don't always need, they're not all startups. They need different types of finance, and we tend to see them and pigeonhole them as one type of entrepreneur. If we want to be able to work with those who have the potential to graduate, we should be able to diversify the response, both on the private sector side, like the resource side, the financing, as well as the policy response.
So Keiko, I have to agree with you. There's no easy answer, and I don't think that there's any leapfrog magical solution. There's a lot of hard work solutions that require commitment from many partners to move the needle on this issue. But it can move. That's the message, with a lot of commitment. So final question, and then I think that we've got 30 seconds I can give to each of you for doing final remarks. Christian, 1 minute from you, please. Recently, there are suggestions that the US low unemployment rate is perhaps due to employers' labour hoarding, oh my goodness, on the back of painful experiences through shortage of labour in the pandemic. Are there any trends, behaviour like that in Asia? 1 minute, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for this question, which is an interesting one. But I mean, I think the situation, the labor market situation and recovery in Asia has been, I think, quite different from the recovery that we have seen in some of the advanced economies like the US. So clearly, labor market recovery has been faster in some of the advanced economies, also due to the government support. So the labor market tightness, I think, is quite different. And I'm of course familiar with the ongoing skills shortages that I think many employers face in the US. I think, in Asia, it really depends, right? So if you look at jobs which require, let's say, lower qualifications, like low, medium skill jobs, then I would say there has probably not been any labor hoarding, since there's simply so much labor supply available. There are so many workers available and ready to take up actually jobs with this level of skills. But when we talk really about the very highly specialized, high skill jobs, then I do think that implicitly we do perhaps see something like labor hoarding in the data. Perhaps I would not name it that way, but I think this is partially reflected in the fact that we have seen actually a smaller negative employment impact on workers in high skill occupations than workers in other occupations and in lower skill occupations. And to some extent, of course, this reflects that employers really want to keep those highly specialized workers, and many of them have kept them even during the ongoing or the COVID crisis, and now continue to keep them in their workforce in the crisis that we are experiencing now. So yeah, so that would be my response to that. Thanks a lot.
Okay, and Christian, I just give you maybe 20 seconds for any key takeaway.
So as key takeaway, I think, the challenges are obviously huge. And we have talked a lot about the different types of challenges that countries are facing, that labor markets are facing. But then I do think it's good if we end on a positive message. And I think this is also what is coming out, that, there are lots of policy areas and policy actions that are possible to, provide some support to economies, to the labor market, in order to basically improve the situation and tackle all the challenges and really grasp all the opportunities. So there's, I think, a lot that can be done. There are, I think, some positive examples. We've heard about that during this talk. So I think I think that's the good news. So we are not left in the doom and gloom, but there are some solutions, and it requires simply leadership and full commitment of governments together with social partners to really take some action.
All right, Callista, 20-second wrap up from you, please.
I just want to reiterate that I think digital and green goes hand in hand, and let's not forget that. There is also more upside, more new jobs being created there are actually jobs lost. So that's the second message that I want to say. Now, the most important thing around how we can capture that new market, the ecosystem, government, companies, workers, schools will have to come together such that we make sure that we have trained enough people to capture onto those jobs. Change is not easy. We have to make sure that there are policies in place to cushion and for safety net. So that really is my key message. And I do want to say that again. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah, I love that key message. We give the last word to you, Keiko. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I guess I would say, let's make labour markets work better for women. So let's think about all the different gender gaps that we know. And we need to think about those silver linings, trying to end on a good note. There's a lot of good examples, analysis, data out there to make labour markets work better for women. But just to pick up on Christian's point, it does require some leadership and some vision to make that happen. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice point to end on, especially for a Friday afternoon. So thank you very much for giving us your time today. I was really stimulated by all of the things that you've shared, and I hope that you've enjoyed our spot session with Third Economists. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Good Friday. Yeah,
Thank you.
Friday. Thank you. Bye.